So we've been talking about keeping Christianity weird. We've been talking about faithful presence, emphasis on the faithful part, and talking about things. A couple of weeks ago, I guess the last build we had, I was talking about sex and sexuality. Yeah. So those of you that came in late, I'm not the regularly scheduled programming. Drew is pretty under the weather, and so he asked me yesterday afternoon to fill in for him. So this is going to be a challenge. Just go ahead and tell you. But I think it is important. So we're trying to talk about tonight is identity and how we form an identity. And to do that, we're going to go back and look at the work of a guy who was a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. In the 1950s and 60s, and was somewhat of a prophet, and the way that he kind of applied how to explain culture and the different ways that culture has looked throughout history is a way in which we can, it's kind of a grid or a framework through which we can look at and understand a little bit better how, or the culture that we're in today and why it is the way that it is. So I mentioned this already, but audience participation is required tonight. It's not optional. I'm demanding. You have to participate because there's a lot of gaps in here, and I think I understand what I'm talking about, but there's a difference between me understanding it while I'm reading it in my office, just me, myself, and I, and trying to talk about it to a group of people. So help me out here, okay? Anyway, this guy's name was Philip Reef. I am going to use some scripture texts, so you can grab the Pew Bible or, grab the Pew Bible. Don't use your phone. His name was Philip Reef, and in 1966 he wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Hard to believe that was in 1966. He saw a lot of things that were kind of on the cusp of happening in the broader culture. And one of the things that he argued was it is in communal activities that individuals discover themselves, that they establish their identities. And he called those traditional cultures. And he said, in a traditional culture, the self is given and learned. It's not something that an individual creates for themselves. Does that make sense? The self is given and learned. And so what happens is, in traditional cultures, the culture directs an individual outward. It says, as you grow up, it says, okay, you need to look to this and this and this, either this group of people or this institution, to learn who you are. And that culture is greater than and is prior to, it exists before the person was born. It's greater than that person because it's bigger than that person, but it's also very formative of that person. And this is the statement that I would love for you to interact with, and then we'll look at a couple of passages from the scriptures that I hope kind of apply this, or at least we can talk through, hopefully, to apply it. So here's the statement. We learn who we are by learning to conform ourselves to the purposes of the larger community to which we belong. Now, that may not hit you like it hit me, but I'm the one up here talking, so I get to pick what hit me and then have you interact with it. Let me repeat it. We learn who we are by learning to conform ourselves to the purposes of the larger community to which we belong. Interact with that statement. Give me your thoughts. What strikes you there? What do you feel like is maybe countercultural? What do you feel like is in line with Christianity? Right. Uh-huh. Okay. Excuse me. What if I substituted and said, we learn who we are by learning to conform ourselves to the purposes of the church to which we belong? Okay, you like that better. Okay. Because Reef was Catholic. He was applying it more broadly, but you could apply it to Christianity for sure. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. The world itself. Yeah, absolutely. Which is true, right? Romans 12, don't be conformed to this world. Funny enough, I'm gonna get you to Romans 12, okay? But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Part of what he's trying to argue for here is that historically, uh, individuals did not formulate who they were and learn about themselves and make sense of their life on their own. They did it in the context of so you can see this all around the world, right? People from Eastern cultures tend to not even think of themselves as individuals. They think of themselves in relationship to their family, almost as if they don't exist as an individual. And that's on kind of one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum is, of course, well, us, right? The United States or the West, which is all about you making yourself in however you want to do that. And so there's a lot more, and there's shades of this, right, depending on the community that you're in. So just take COVID, for example, right? You know the communities, the micro communities and micro populations in the U.S. and around the world that had really high rates of COVID and the ones that had very low rates of COVID, don't you? The Scandinavian countries have very low rates of COVID. You know why? Because extended families don't do much over there. It's the mom and the dad and maybe one kid or two kids. And then there's lots of single people. Well, the Latin community had huge amounts of COVID. Why is that? Because family is a big deal in the Latin community. So Hispanic families have like multiple generations sometimes living together, right? It's just normal. Same thing with the African American community, right? Extended families do a lot together a lot of time, and so you saw the virus spread as a result of that. But even that is indicative of those people believe, and culturally over many years, they have reinforced the fact that you learn who you are as you belong to and conform yourself to the purposes of a larger community. Okay. I think that's a really important statement. Now, how does it translate to the scripture or to Christianity and to the church? Well, one, in our context, baptism, we baptize children, and we have the whole congregation raise their hand, right, to give a vow to say, will you support the parents as they nurture this child? Basically saying to the parents, you've got all of these assistant parents helping you, right? And we take that really seriously. But I think at least part of the disconnect for us is the fact that we're Americans, we live in the West and so forth, that we have a hard time believing that. We have a hard time accessing that, right? We just don't believe it's actually the case, I don't think, oftentimes. So look at Romans 12, okay? Romans 12, beginning in verse 10, okay? Romans 12, beginning in verse 10. I'm going to read from 10 to 13. And I just want you to interact with this and tell me, okay, how does this apply? You may say, I don't think it does. Okay, great. We'll move on. But tell me how you think it might apply to this idea that we learn who we are as we conform ourselves to the purposes of the larger community. So think of it this way. If a child, if a teenager, if a new Christian, okay, someone is converted and they come into the church and they begin to be around people who behave this way, will they become like this? Will their identity shift, right? Will it become one in which they're sort of defining themselves and making their own way? Or will it be one in which they sort of put their identity here and the broader community they're a part of, all those things begin to percolate down into their life? Verse 10, love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Okay, talk to me about those verses. What kind of person, what kind of community is created by a group of people taking just those verses right there seriously?
I think the verses are pointing to the character of the type of person who is a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
right? A believer.
Yeah,
So
sure.
if I apply it back to the psychology of or the mindset of how people identify, um, to what you were talking about earlier, right? He's talking about like children need to be raised and taught who they are, right,
Right.
and what they think, and
Yeah.
parents protect them and guide them and provide, um, I guess, guidance for who we are as a family, as a man or a woman,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
just in general. And so this is provide the scriptures providing what those character traits ought to be, things that we ought to look like, which families extend down and build on that.
Yep.
What we're seeing today, though, is all of that's out the window because uh, it's up to the new believer, or it's up to the child to determine their own character traits,
Mm-hmm.
right? The parents can't dictate who their child's going to be, or
Right.
how they're going to behave a certain way, right? It's up to them. It's what's their perception of
Yeah.
right and wrong. So all those character
You're
traits
saying the
extend
broader
out.
culture's teaching that.
Right, that's what
Yeah.
the culture is teaching
Yeah.
today
Sure.
in the West.
No, absolutely. It's just a paint. Those verses are painting a picture, right? It's a beautiful picture. The question is, what does it look? What is a person, or is a person captivated? Is a person conformed as they enter into a community of people, whether it's the small community of a nuclear family, or think more broadly about the church as a whole? A new Christian comes in, they see people behaving that way, right? Do they begin to learn who they are differently as a result of that? That's part of what Reef is arguing.
Especially identity, broadly speaking, is determined by experience,
Uh huh. Yeah.
and usually by suffering or trial that people like the modern Westerner would form their identity by their sense of suffering or tribulation or trial. And so to me, what Paul is saying is so against that
Mm-hmm.
is, from verse 17 down, repay no one evil for evil. So that assumes you've been wrong,
Yeah.
and not just perceive that you've been wrong, but
Yeah.
that you have actually been wrong.
Right.
And you turn around and you don't form yourself around that,
Mm-hmm.
but you love them
Mm-hmm.
peaceably with all. You don't avenge yourself, but you
Right.
love God. So that to me is where, um, as the community of the church begins to live that out, that's going to, I think, get at the heart of some of the identity, the falseness of experience establishes identity
Yeah.
personally versus community
Right.
walks the
Yeah.
proper direction towards identity.
That's true. Absolutely. He says it's in the communal activities that individuals discover themselves, and it's, to Brad's point, in the nuclear family, the communal activities of a nuclear family that they discover themselves or establish their identities. And so, you know, if as a child you grown up in the communal activities, you never do it right, or you always show up wrongly, then what do you grow up with the mindset of, well, I can't ever do anything right, or most people probably don't experience me well, so people don't really like me, so I'm not gonna, there's all these seeds that get planted. And we don't necessarily need to go there, but the point is the thing that he's talking about as a traditional culture is something that directed, and you still do this with your kids, you direct them not inward but outward. Now, the culture is very, very, what's the word? Um, like with a vengeance, uh, encouraging them to look inward to form those things. But he says in traditional cultures, it's always individuals being directed outward so that they learn who they are as they participate in this thing out here. Okay? Does all that make sense, what I'm saying? And within the church, it has huge implications for discipleship as well and how people get formed. Let me read one other one before moving on. Hebrews chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Let brotherly love continue. So, last chapter of the book of Hebrews. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I don't think we're going to talk about money in this build series, so you're safe. I know it's a sensitive topic. Drew was like, you always tell people when you're going to have the sex talk, but you never tell them when you're going to have the money talk, right? I think we've run out of time, so there's not going to be a money talk. But he may surprise us and have a money talk next week. Anyway, those are 5 verses, again, very distinctive in the culture that is being described there, right? It's a culture of people who, what are some of the different things that it says? Like, describe those people that I just read to me in your own words. Humility is really what? Really prevalent? Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Right. Uh-huh. What's Micah 6:8? Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Right. It's one verse, very simple in its kind of layout, but uh-huh. Yes. Yes. That's right. That's right. Uh-huh. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. 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 Yeah, our identity, where Christians are in this weird sort of in between, and Western Christians really have to work on, like I was saying earlier, there's this pendulum swing. We got to work on it's not just me, myself, and I. Eastern Christians have to work on, no, as an individual, you do have, rights and responsibilities and dignity and so forth, because in Genesis 1, it's God made male and female in his image, right? So there's this balance, but to Jamie's point, as we experience, for many of us, family, you say that word, there's all kinds of dysfunctional things that come up in your mind. But in terms of if I say, okay, what about church family? Then oftentimes people's face brightens up. They're really, oh yeah, oh my church, I love my church. My church family is amazing, right? Um, and sad that the one is doesn't produce a smile and the other one does, but it does reinforce we are building and experiencing a culture around us, and our identity gets tied into that. Now, uh, Reef talked about. Oh, you're not supposed to read that. I didn't even realize it was up there. But I think Joe had to put it up there because he came and sat down here, which is not Joe's fault, so it's fine. But try to ignore that for just a minute, okay? It's long and got a lot of words, so don't. We'll get to it in a minute, okay? But what Reef talked about was he said over the course of history, what's happened is you have first world, second world, third world. Now, we talk about third world oftentimes in terms of like the developing world, the poorer parts of the world. He doesn't mean it that way, okay? But he says this, and I would love to hear your thought on this statement. The essential culture of a society is determined by the things that it forbids and how it forbids them. The essential culture of a society is determined by the things that it forbids and how it forbids them. So if you think about in the first world, it's like paganism, okay? Or if you want to just use a word, just use the word fate. So in the first world, the idea was okay. There is a moral framework. There is some sort of transcendent thing, system beyond me, right? The foundation for how things work in this culture and in this world lie in something beyond us. Okay. Well, in the pagan world, the basis for certain behaviors was based on the authority of a god or a goddess or someone mediating that authority. And the example he uses is if you went to Sparta back in the day. Anybody see the movie 300? Okay, you know what I'm talking about with the Spartans, right? These are like bad dudes. So if you went to the king of Sparta and you said, how do you know how you're supposed to govern Sparta? Or he would say, you can't do that way, you have to do it this way. And if the Spartan said, O king, why is that? What would he say? He would not say, because I said so. He would say, because the oracle at Delphi, who revealed to us our system and the way we're supposed to do things, said so. So you see, even there, he's pointing to some authority beyond himself. Okay? So Reef says that's an example of the first world. Okay? Your destiny is in the hands of the fates. You guys know this from seeing that movie or seeing any other movie. Maybe not the new Amazon Ring of Power stuff, but probably the Game of Thrones stuff or any other fantasy things about that whole world, right? They talk about the fates or fate, right? In the case of the second world, it's faith, okay? Not fate, but faith. And obviously, this is a world primarily impacted by Christianity. Christianity influencing everything from justice to family relationships to conducting business affairs. Just think about this for a minute. What does it say about our legal system's sense of accountability that anytime you go into a courtroom and you are on trial or you engage in a trial, what do you do before you take the stand? You hold up your hand and you put your other hand where? On a Bible. And they said, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. There is this sense in which something, someone beyond this room we're accountable to, or there is some standard beyond what's going on in this room, and we're trying to come to a place where we can figure out what that standard is. Does that make sense? I mean, the process is convoluted, and obviously sinners are involved, and so you have half-truths, and you have real sneaky, this is why attorneys sometimes have bad raps, or judges can be bought off, I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff because you're dealing with sinners. But the idea, at least, is that there's an accountability to some bigger or broader moral structure. That's the second world. Okay? So first world, you've got some transcendence going here. Again, it's not Yahweh per se, it's not God from the scriptures per se, but it is, again, it's not the king of Sparta just saying you'll do this because, well, I said so. Even in Egypt, right, the Pharaoh was seen as, well, divine from some people, or a son of a god, or the gods by other people. And so there was, the Egyptians were thinking, okay, there's gods, and they're out there controlling things, and they're bigger than me. And so how I develop my life and, do certain activities or not other activities is impacted by that. Okay? Now, we live in the third world, okay? And he says this. He says, we live in an age in the West where the dominant culture is one that rejects any transcendent sacred order and is thus foundationally different from what preceded it. Moral instability and volatility are the order of the day. Everybody said, amen, right? We all feel that. We all understand that, right? It is ethical mishmash in our world today. And so much so that and I so wanted to show the clip, but I thought that'll get me in trouble. It's too kind of, it's borderline. Anyway, so this was a political situation. And I'm not going to give you any names or tell you, hopefully I can describe it without giving it away of the context. But basically, this person is commenting, and they're of a particular side of the spectrum that says this behavior is wrong. But as they're describing another person who's running for office who apparently engaged in the behavior, they said, I don't care that they've engaged in that behavior because the greater thing that I'm concerned about is winning. And it was like, I watched it today. It was only about a minute and a half. But I watched it today, even as I was thinking about some of this. I was like, wow, that's it. Like, that person is not saying, no, there's a line here. And when you cross the line, okay, that's not okay. You shouldn't cross the line. But it depends on who crosses the line. I mean, it's just ethical mishmash. It's It's volatility, it's instability, we just don't know. Now, if you take the fact that we live in this third world and you combine it with there is a plummeting of public confidence and trust in almost every institution across the board, okay? And you can look up the statistics, they're very striking. Institutions like church, schools, doctors and hospitals, and the statistics I saw were in 2018. How 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 do you think public trust has gone since 2020 in doctors and hospitals? Even further than it already was down, right? The presidency, Congress, okay? So if you combine the fact we live in this third world where it's kind of a there's no transcendent sacred order. There's no sense of having something to pass down. It's I'm going to break all of that stuff and make my own way, and no one trusts any institution. Then who do you think people want to form themselves? Not any institution. They don't trust institutions. And so Philip Reef says we're actually in an anti-culture because culture was intended to establish order out of chaos. Okay? If you go all the way back to like ancient cultures, right? Or nomadic tribal peoples, and they would travel, and when they finally decided to settle down, what did they have to do? They had to plant crops, build homes to live in, gather some livestock and figure all that stuff out. They were bringing order out of this chaotic landscape. We actually live, he says, in an anti-culture where the goal is not to establish order out of chaos, it's to create chaos out of order. It's the opposite. And you've got things like what he calls, well, C.S. Lewis actually called chronological snobbery, which basically is, well, we've evolved and we know. I mean, in 2022, we know. Those idiots that lived in 1822, I mean, what did they know? Or the people in 1922, they were a little bit better, but not as good as us, right? So then what do you begin to do? You begin to critique and tear down all of the things that have come to you up through the ages and time. The destruction of some of those things, and then forgetfulness. So to take an example of this, and again, this may get me into trouble, but I'm just submitting it to you as an example. So a few years ago, a thing New York Times came out with, it was called the 1619 Project. And what it was doing was it was arguing that the American Revolution was really about slavery. And a guy wrote a critique of it, a historian wrote a critique of it. And one of the things that he said was that some of the scholarship that this 1619 Project used, and the New York Times intended for this to go out and be used at high school curriculums and so forth and so on. They had a big vision for it. But this particular historian said the problem is some of the scholarship that they are kind of using as a backbone of what they're arguing has only been in place since 2010. Like the things, the articles that are being quoted, the books that are being referenced, all this kind of stuff. That's an example of what I'm talking about. Because they're using things that are barely a decade old to make this enormous historical case for something that's really, really big. And he said, this particular historian that I'm referring to, he said, there are examples in shades of what they're arguing, but they only went back to 2010 in the scholarship. I wish they would have gone back even further. That's an example of what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not picking on the New York Times. I'm not picking on any individual or institution per se. I'm just using that as an example because it did cause a lot of, uproar in some corners. But that's what that's what Reef is talking about. Does this make sense here? This first, second, and third. I don't know what word to use here other than just chaos. I mean, that's really what it is. Does does this sort of breaking this down make sense? The Reformation, from a historical standpoint, happened 1600s, right? The Reformation happened in a second world context. So it wasn't, they weren't arguing over the fact that there's no transcendent moral order. They were arguing about how that gets applied through arguing about the scriptures and different things like that. Everybody aware of that? If not, you can Google it. Or come to the membership class, third membership class. I'll be teaching it, and I do church history in like 10 minutes. All of church history, 10 minutes. One board, one long line. It's a lot of fun. I mean, I find it a lot of fun. You may find it really boring, but anyway, maybe we'll answer some of those questions. Anyway, so we're down here, and instead of what has historically been a way in which the individual is pointed outward and is formed by something greater than itself, which happened in the first world, second world, the third world, that's not happening at all. What's an example of where that continues to happen, even in spite of some of the dominant cultural forces? Can anybody give me an example of an institution? Great, Joe. Why do you say Nick Saban? Uh-huh. That's right. Now, Joe, everyone in the room may not know who Nick Saban is. I know that's hard for you to believe, but Nick Saban is the football coach at the University of Alabama, okay, which has been a pretty dominant football program for a long time, okay. But I will apply it to Kirby in the sense that what happens when really good leaders disciple people into their image, so to speak? They tend to behave the same, and they tend to build similar cultures too, or at least believe in the strength of culture building. We can talk about Dabo Swinney too. That's the coach of Clemson, but we're not going to get into all the college football stuff. The point is, right, that's an example. What's another one? What's another institution where people are formed by the community that they join? Okay. Yeah. They're really strong, right? What about like a national institution? The only one that Barna has found over the years confidence and trust in has not waned. The military. Say again? It's eroding in the military too. It is. The third world's very powerful. That's right. That's right. And Reef would say that's a throwback to the first and second world's impact, and the third world being kind of the way that kids, it's like they're bathed and baptized in that. So when the army presents an opportunity, they say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be told what to do, right? Those kinds of things. Go ahead, Ashley. Uh huh. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
serves our country.
Mm-hmm.
So it submits to the will of the public.
Right.
And so, he said it's just getting, it's just really the leadership culture is not what it was
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
within there. And I don't think he was being nostalgic. I think
Sure. Sure.
he's seen some real, struggles.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
The response to that would be cynicism, which is another part of the living in the third world piece. Like you would respond to that and you would say, he's just being a stud. He just,
One thing, not to take us off track, but 2 weeks ago when we were talking about the sexual stuff, I mean, just I feel like there's a connection in the struggle to understand identity and this chaos that we're in. It just feels
Mm-hmm.
like it overlaps.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because we're trying to help teenagers and we're trying to help young people get to that place of
Yeah.
solid identity, and we're trying to do it in the midst of this anti-culture, and it's so much harder.
It, it,
It's so
it
much
really
easier
is.
to get
Yeah.
there, and it's not so much about sexual orientation; it's about identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and the groundwork and the foundation of identity is being eroded
Yeah.
slowly.
Those forces are very, very powerful. What were we going to say, Tony?
I was just going to say, I don't think this is accidental.
Okay.
I think this has been going on for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the division and the chaos that's been sown in all our institutions is purposeful.
Yeah.
I mean, it is.
Right.
Once you sow the division and everybody's going their own way, what is it? I don't, the house divided, it's on purpose. It's blatant.
Well, Reef's book was in 1966, and then he wrote other books, but it was back then. I mean, he didn't write this like 5 years ago. So it's
It just, in some ways, the conversation feels like we're talking about institutions collapsing,
uh-huh.
an outside force pushing in, but in many ways it feels like there's been implosion.
Yeah.
These institutions have failed.
Right. Right.
There are thought processes in that culture that we were to absorb
Yeah.
that are wrong.
Yeah.
You look back and you could say whether it's racism or anything, those were touted by government,
Leaders.
church,
Mm-hmm.
by
Yeah.
leaders
Right.
who failed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways it feels like implosion happened, leading to some of that lack of trust.
Right.
This feels more or less like a linear conversation than a spiral,
Yeah.
upward or downward. Is that
Yeah.
historically we've been through these phases,
Yeah.
and they repeat themselves.
Right.
So,
Right. Right. No, it's just a way, and this, of course, is not the only way to view history or something like that, right? It's just a helpful framework that we wanted to bring up with y'all and just kind of offer and introduce, because the name Philip Reef was certainly new to me, and reading a couple books over the last couple of years. One example of this, and then I'll read this quote, and that's where I wanted to end, is with this quote that's back here. Reef says that the way anti-culture stuff gets worked out, that is, creating chaos out of order, is through something he calls death works. Isn't that a great name? Death works. And so, an illustration of a death work is pornography. And he explains it like this. He says, pornography is a cultural artifact that takes human sexual activity and divorces it from any moral content. Sex is an end unto itself. It is divorced from any sense of functioning as a part of a greater whole. Does this sound familiar? I mean, it's the same thing as is happening in a lot of different on a lot of different fronts. What pornography does is it repudiates any notion that sex has significance beyond the act itself, and then it therefore rejects any notion that it is an emblem or a symbol of a sacred order. And so he says this is part of the way that anti-culture happens, is through these very specific. He uses a lot of art illustrations, but I didn't want to use those. One of them is very vile, I mean, it's a real thing, but it's very vile. I didn't even want to bring that one up. But pornography is something that, unfortunately, we're all familiar with and understand kind of the way that it has impacted the culture. So it's a good example of that, how the we're actually in an anti-culture. It's creating chaos, out of order, and to Tony's point, it's doing it intentionally, right? It's doing it intentionally. And so as Christians, how do you we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and I think as Drew and I have talked a little bit, one of his burdens, even for build and some of this series, it's hard in the setting that we're doing build in, but is to have conversations about how do we as Christians engage with those who we either befriend or work beside or what have you, live beside, who are kind of hook, line, and sinker into this way of thinking, right? How do we do that? And I think to know where it has arisen, and then what is the difference, right? What is the distinctiveness? I thought of this verse a few minutes ago, and then I closed my Bible, but this is just the power I think that we have. 1 Peter 3. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. And I just thought there are a lot of times where the culture that people are looking into, the window into the church they're seeing, and they're seeing people who bless each other instead of, when they curse or they show hospitality or they behave. They relate to prisoners as though they were imprisoned, and some of those other things in Romans 12 and Hebrews 13. They look into and they see that, and we don't necessarily even have to say anything. They can just, without a word, see something really beautiful and see that a completely different identity is getting formed and shaped. So let me read this quote. I don't know why I'm turning around. I have it on my sheet here. This is from Yuval Levin, his book called A Time to Build. He is not, to my knowledge, a Christian, but I was really, really struck by this. And so I just want you to think about the church, okay? He's talking about institutions as a whole. Just apply this to the church. There is a dire need for men and women at every level in each of our society's institutions, and it's true, to channel their energies into that institution's objectives and purposes, defining their ambitions by its distinctive modes of integrity, seeking its aspirations as theirs, adopting its ethos for their own, and understanding its boundaries and not just its powers as formative. I thought, man, that's great. Okay? So we need to seek to channel our energies into the institution's objectives and purposes, and seek to be formed by it, adopt its ethos, and understand its boundaries and not just its powers as formative. I realize this is how third world and cynical conditioned I am. I realize as a leader of one of the leaders of an institution, and I'm calling you there's a dire need for you to channel your energy into the institution's objectives. Can sound self-serving. I mean, that's how conditioned I am by words or power plays, and you can't trust leaders and things like that. But let me speak for the other leaders that you hardly ever see, right? Our elders and our deacons. Because they're not preaching every Sunday, they're not up here leading build and stuff like that. You're in good hands. These are godly, honorable, humble men who very quickly admit when they don't know, and have very strong desire to do God honoring things with the institution that has been placed under their care. And so pray for them. But that's what we want. We want to see men and women channel their energies into that institution's objectives and purposes so as to be formed by it in a distinctive way, right? Does that make sense? as to arrive at an identity that you don't put together. God has put it together for you, and as we do this together from the scriptures, we really can be faithfully present in the world. So I have 7:33. So we don't want the catechism people to hate us. But thank you for being here. Really, really appreciate that. And again, Sundays 2 services, please come, number one. And number two, please bring a friend, because we're going to have 2 different spaces for people to join us in. And next week will be the last build for the fall. So, Father, go with us now and help us to be a distinctive people. Help us to be, as I forget who said it, or I forget, maybe it was a book title, a peculiar people, a weird people, a strange people, and yet a people that when we are together and when those who are outside look in through the window into the type of culture that is forming the people who are part of this particular institution, it would be beautiful, it would be attractive, it would be otherworldly, it would cause them to be astonished and full of wonder, and they'd climb through the window as fast as they could because they'd want to be a part of it. And it wouldn't be anything we've done, but it would be to your honor and glory because it's your culture. It's what you've formed and you've put together. It's your ideas. It's your way of doing life. And so help us submit to it. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.